The first time my boss laughed at me, it was during my resignation meeting, and I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't loud or cruel, not the kind that echoes. It was a short, dismissive chuckle, the kind people make when they believe they've already won. He leaned back in his leather chair, glanced at the folded resignation letter in his hand, and said, "You'll be back. They always are." In that moment, with the city skyline glowing behind him and my 17 years of loyalty reduced to a punchline, something inside me went very still. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked out of the office knowing something he didn't, that the laughter was premature. For most people, resigning is an emotional explosion. Raised voices, long speeches, burned bridges. But I had learned over years of corporate survival that silence is often the sharpest weapon. I was 46 years old, a senior operations lead at a mid-sized logistics tech firm based in Chicago, and I had spent nearly 2 decades building systems no one else fully understood. I wasn't flashy. I didn't network well. I didn't play golf with executives. What I did do was quietly design the backbone of the company's regional fulfillment model, the process that allowed them to promise next-day delivery without bleeding money. The executives loved the results. They just never cared much for the man behind them. The laughter wasn't about my resignation itself. It was about timing. 2 weeks earlier, I had been passed over for a promotion that I had been verbally promised for over a year. Instead, the role went to a younger external hire with a big personality and a resume heavy on buzzwords and light on substance. When I asked for feedback, my boss smiled politely and told me I was invaluable where I was. That was corporate code for stuck. I knew then that nothing I built would ever belong to me in their eyes. It would just be absorbed, rebranded, and credited to someone else. So I prepared, quietly, methodically. I documented everything, every workflow dependency, every vendor exception, every automation trigger that required manual oversight at specific intervals. I handed over exactly what policy required, no more, no less. And when my final day came, I shook hands, turned in my badge, and left behind a team that assumed things would keep running the way they always had. That assumption lasted precisely 11 days. It started small, a shipment delay in Ohio. Then a routing conflict in Texas. Minor inefficiencies that triggered bigger delays because no one realized why certain safeguards existed in the first place. By week 3, customer complaints were stacking up, penalties were being applied, and emergency meetings were being called. My replacement was competent, but competence doesn't replace institutional memory. Systems I had tuned by hand over years began drifting out of alignment, and no one knew how to bring them back. That's when my phone rang. It was my former boss. His voice was different, tight, rushed, stripped of amusement. He asked if I'd be open to consulting temporarily to stabilize operations. I paused before answering, not out of spite, but because I needed him to understand the shift that had occurred. I told him I'd consider it. Then I named my terms, a short contract, a rate triple my previous salary, and one non-negotiable condition, decision authority over the systems I touched. There was silence on the line. Then quietly he agreed. When I walked back into that building 2 days later, no one laughed. People stepped aside. Meetings stopped mid-sentence when I entered rooms. The same executives who had ignored my emails for years suddenly wanted my input on everything. I fixed what needed fixing, not because I owed them, but because I take pride in my work. And when the contract ended, I left again, this time on my own terms, with a check large enough to fund the next chapter of my life. I later heard through former colleagues that my boss no longer laughed in meetings. The experience had changed him. Maybe it humbled him. Maybe it just scared him. Either way, I didn't need an apology or vindication. The outcome spoke for itself, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's letting someone laugh, right up until they realize they never understood your value at all. By the time I stood up from my chair, the laughter was still echoing in the conference room, that smug, dismissive sound my boss always made when he thought he'd won. He'd leaned back, hands behind his head, like this was all a joke to him, like my resignation letter was a tantrum instead of a calculated move. "You'll be back," he said, shaking his head. "Everyone always is." I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that I'd already transferred ownership of the client relationships to my personal LLC, that the non-compete he loved to threaten people with had a very specific carve-out his legal team forgot to update 3 years ago. I simply thanked him for the opportunity, wished the team luck with Q4, and walked out while he was still smiling. The elevator ride down felt unreal, like stepping off a plane after turbulence, quiet, weightless, almost peaceful. What he didn't know was that the resignation email had gone out an hour earlier to every major client I managed, informing them I'd be unavailable starting Monday and introducing them to my new consultancy, with a calendar link already filling up faster than I expected. The shock didn't hit him until the following week. On Monday morning, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from former coworkers asking what was happening, telling me the office felt like it was on fire. 2 clients had paused contracts. Another demanded a meeting with whoever actually understands our account. By Tuesday, the laughter was gone. By Wednesday, he was calling me directly, leaving voicemails that started professional and ended strained. "Let's talk," he said. "There's no reason to burn bridges." I listened to them all calmly while finalizing my first invoice, one with a rate triple what I'd been making as his employee. When we finally did speak, his tone had shifted completely. No jokes, no smirk, just urgency. He asked what it would take for me to come back. I told him the truth, I wasn't coming back. I'd already moved on, and so had his clients. The outcome shocked him because it wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no shouting match, no legal threat, no viral LinkedIn post. There was just a quiet transfer of power. Within 3 months, my old department was restructured, then downsized. His quarterly results missed projections for the first time in years. I heard through the grapevine that he stopped laughing in meetings after that. As for me, I worked fewer hours, made more money, and slept better than I had in a decade. The funniest part wasn't that he laughed at my resignation. It was that he thought laughter was leverage. Turns out, the only thing that really matters is knowing when to stand up, walk out, and let the silence do the talking. He laughed when I handed in my resignation, a short bark of amusement that echoed off the glass walls of his corner office, like I'd just told a joke instead of quietly ending a 12-year chapter of my life. He didn't even read the letter at first. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "You'll be back. Everyone who leaves here comes back. They always do." I remember noticing how relaxed he looked, how certain, how comfortable a man can be when he thinks he holds all the leverage. I nodded, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked out while he was still smiling. What he didn't realize was that the laugh was the last moment he'd feel in control. For most people, resigning is an emotional explosion. Anger, speeches, slammed doors. Mine was surgical. For years, I'd been the person nobody noticed because nothing ever broke. Systems ran. Clients stayed happy. Deadlines were met. In corporate America, competence without drama makes you invisible. My boss loved to take credit in board meetings, loved to talk about his operational discipline, his risk controls, his vendor relationships. He never mentioned my name, and I stopped expecting him to. What he didn't know was that those vendor relationships were personal, not corporate, built over late-night calls, emergency fixes, and favors exchanged when no one else would help. He also didn't know I'd been quietly documenting everything for years, not out of paranoia but out of habit. The real reason I resigned wasn't burnout or a better offer, though I had one waiting. It was the meeting 2 weeks earlier when he publicly blamed me for a delay he'd personally caused. He did it casually, with a shrug in front of senior leadership. I corrected him politely. He smiled and said, "Let's not get into details." That was the moment I understood exactly how disposable I was to him and how valuable I actually was everywhere else. That night, instead of venting to my wife, I made a list. Every system I maintained, every contract I personally negotiated, every compliance exception only I knew how to handle, not to sabotage, just to be honest with myself. When my resignation email went out company-wide the next morning, the responses didn't come from leadership. They came from clients. Vendors, regional managers, people who wrote things like, "Wait, who's going to handle our account now? And is this a mistake?" My boss ignored the noise. He even joked in the hallway that I was finally trying the open market. He assigned my responsibilities to 3 people and told HR it would be fine after a short transition. There was no transition. I had already given everything I was contractually required to give, nothing more, nothing less. The first crack appeared on day 4 after my departure, when a major vendor paused shipments over a contract clause no one else understood. My phone rang. I didn't answer. The second crack came when an automated process failed because a manual override was needed, one I'd warned about for years but was always told we'd deal with later. By the end of the second week, later had arrived with invoices, penalties, and very uncomfortable calls from the board. That's when my boss stopped laughing. He called me directly, no greeting, no apology, just, "Can you help us fix this?" I listened quietly the way he never had. Then I told him I'd already accepted another role and was unavailable, but that I'd be happy to consult at my standard rate. Silence, then disbelief, then anger. He said my number was ridiculous. I said it reflected urgency. He hung up. 2 days later, his assistant called back and accepted. By the time I walked back into that building as an external consultant, no one was smiling. My former boss wouldn't meet my eyes. The board thanked me for stepping in. I fixed what I agreed to fix, documented nothing extra, and left again, this time with a check that exceeded my old annual bonus. 3 months later, he was gone. Officially, it was a strategic leadership change. Unofficially, everyone knew why. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just learned something most people never do until it's too late. Respect isn't demanded with authority, and leverage doesn't come from titles. It comes from knowing your value before someone else decides it for you. He laughed at my resignation because he thought it was the end of my story. It was only the part where his stopped intersecting with mine. The laugh came first. A short, sharp bark of it echoing off the glass walls of the conference room like he'd just heard a joke at my expense, which in his mind he had. My boss leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head, eyes flicking down to the resignation letter I'd slid across the table. "You're serious," he said, still smiling. "In this market." The HR rep shifted uncomfortably beside him, but he didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the moment. 20 years in corporate America teaches you how to recognize contempt when it's dressed up as confidence. I stood there calmly, hands folded, while he explained, at length, how replaceable I was, how the company would keep moving without me, how people always overestimated their leverage. I let him finish. I even nodded once. He mistook that for defeat. What he didn't know was that I'd already untangled myself from every quiet obligation that kept his department alive. For years, I'd been the one smoothing vendor disputes before they reached legal, the one who knew which compliance shortcuts would trigger audits and which ones wouldn't, the one fielding panicked calls from regional managers at 11 p.m. so they didn't land on his desk. None of it was in my job description, and none of it was documented, because he liked it that way. "You're my secret weapon," he used to say, right before passing me over for promotion again. The laugh told me everything I needed to know. He thought I was bluffing. He thought I needed him more than he needed me. I walked out that afternoon without ceremony, badge dropped at security, desk already cleared. By Monday morning, the cracks started to show. A supplier froze shipments after a contract dispute no one else knew how to resolve. A routine compliance review escalated when a regulator asked questions my boss couldn't answer without my notes. 2 senior analysts followed me out within a week, people I'd quietly mentored and recommended elsewhere months earlier. My phone buzzed nonstop, but I didn't answer. I was already onboarding with a competitor who understood exactly what I brought with me and had structured my role so I never had to be anyone's secret weapon again. The call finally came on Friday. No laughter this time. Just a tight, brittle voice asking if I'd consider consulting, temporarily, to help stabilize operations. I declined politely. By the end of the quarter, my old boss was gone, escorted out under the same glass walls he once leaned back against, while I watched the news from a corner office across town. The outcome didn't shock me at all. It shocked him because he never understood the difference between someone who needs a job and someone who quietly runs the place. My boss laughed when I slid the resignation letter across his desk, actually laughed, the sharp kind that echoes just a little too long in a glass-walled office. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and looked at me like I'd just told him I was quitting to join a traveling circus. "You'll be back," he said, still smiling. "People always are." I nodded once, calm on the outside, while something settled into place on the inside. Because what he didn't realize, what made that laugh hang in the air like a bad smell, was that I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I was walking away right on time. I'd been with the company for 16 years. 16 years of fixing messes no one else understood, of answering calls at midnight, of being the quiet solution while louder people took credit. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. I was useful. And in corporate America, being useful without being visible is a dangerous place to live. Over the last year, things had shifted. Promotions went to people who talked well in meetings but froze when systems went down. Decisions were made by PowerPoint instead of experience. My boss, newer, younger, louder, had started treating me like furniture, something solid, reliable, and completely invisible. When I raised concerns, he'd wave them off. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he'd say. I knew that tone. It meant he didn't even know there was a bridge. The resignation letter wasn't emotional, no ultimatums, no speeches, 2 weeks' notice professionally worded. That's why he laughed. He thought it was a bluff, thought I was tired, burned out, fishing for reassurance. "You're walking away from stability," he said. "In this economy." I smiled, thanked him for the opportunity, and stood up. As I reached the door, he added, "Don't expect a counteroffer." I didn't turn around. I didn't need one. What he didn't know was that over the last 2 years, I had quietly become the single point of continuity for 3 major clients. Not officially, on paper, everything looked diversified, but in reality, every escalation, every workaround, every undocumented fix flowed through me. Not because I demanded it, but because people trusted me. When things broke, they didn't call my boss, they called me. And in those conversations, relationships formed, real ones. The kind built on honesty and follow-through, not quarterly targets. On my last day, there was no farewell speech. No cake in the break room, just a few quiet handshakes and a box of personal items. My boss didn't even come by. I walked out at 5 p.m. exactly, got into my car, and felt lighter than I had in years. By Monday morning, I was sitting in a different office, signing a contract with a firm that had been courting me quietly for months. Higher title, better pay. More importantly, authority to build things correctly. The shock came fast. By Wednesday, my phone started lighting up, first from old teammates asking if I'd really left, then from managers trying to sound casual while fishing for information. By Friday, my former boss called, straight to voicemail. He left a message this time, no laughter in his voice. "Hey, we're running into some issues, wondering if you'd be open to a short-term consulting arrangement." I didn't respond. What happened next wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge in the movie sense. It was gravity. Projects stalled because no one understood the full system. Clients escalated because promises had been made without understanding the constraints. Deadlines slipped. One client, my client, paused renewal talks. Another asked for a meeting with someone technical. That someone wasn't there anymore. A month later, I ran into my former boss at a conference. He looked tired, older. The laugh was gone. He tried to play it cool, asked how things were going. "Great," I said honestly. He hesitated, then admitted they were going through a transition. I wished him luck, and I meant it not out of kindness but closure, because the outcome that shocked him wasn't that I left. It wasn't even that things broke. It was that the company didn't collapse, but it changed, slowly, visibly, painfully. They learned the cost of undervaluing the people who actually hold things together, and I learned something too. When someone laughs at your resignation, it's not because they're confident. It's because they don't yet understand what they're about to lose. He laughed when I handed in my resignation. Not a nervous chuckle or a polite corporate smile, an actual laugh, loud enough that a few people in the open office looked up from their screens. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and said, "You'll be back. They always are." 13 years at that company, countless weekends sacrificed, systems I'd built that no one else fully understood, and that was his response. I remember noticing how casual he was about it, how sure. Like he believed the building itself would reject me once I walked out, spit me back onto his doorstep, humbled and desperate. I nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked out without correcting him. There was no point. The outcome was already in motion. What he didn't know, what no one in that office knew, was that my resignation wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't burnout. It wasn't ego. It was timing. For the last year, I'd been quietly documenting everything. The shortcuts he demanded, the compliance warnings he ignored, the way he pressured teams to push half-tested features into production because deadlines matter more than hypotheticals. I'd raised concerns. I'd sent emails. I'd logged risks. Every one of them had been brushed aside with that same laugh, the same confidence that consequences were for other people. So when a recruiter from a competitor reached out, I didn't just listen. I prepared. My last 2 weeks passed uneventfully. He barely acknowledged me except once when he joked in a staff meeting that I was taking a long vacation before crawling back. People laughed awkwardly. I smiled, packed my desk, and left behind a spotless handover document that looked thorough but wasn't generous. Everything critical was there, but only in the way someone who understood it could read. On my final day, he didn't even shake my hand, just waved me off like an employee who didn't matter anymore. 3 weeks later, his confidence cracked. The first call came from a former coworker, whispering like the walls might hear her. "Are you watching the news?" she asked. I was. But I turned it on. There it was, my old company's name scrolling across the bottom of the screen, paired with words like investigation, regulatory review, unexpected outage. The shortcuts he'd laughed about had finally aligned into a perfect failure. A system I had warned him about explicitly, repeatedly, had collapsed under real-world load. Clients were locked out. Transactions failed. Data integrity was questioned. And because I was gone, there was no one left who could explain the architecture fast enough to stop the bleeding. Then came the emails, first from HR, then legal, then finally from him. The tone was different now, no laughter, no swagger, just urgency wrapped in forced politeness. "We'd love to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement," he wrote. "Very competitive rate, immediate need." I read it once, then closed my laptop. I didn't reply that day or the next. By the time I did respond, the board had already stepped in. The investigation widened. Old emails, my emails, surfaced. The ones where I'd flagged risks and been told to stop overthinking. Suddenly, my resignation didn't look impulsive. It looked prophetic. He was placed on administrative leave before the quarter ended. 2 weeks after that, he was gone entirely, replaced by an interim executive whose first move was to call me, not to laugh, but to apologize. I declined the consulting offer anyway, not out of spite, out of clarity. I'd already started my new role by then in an environment where questions weren't treated like insubordination and experience wasn't a punchline. When I heard he'd told people he never saw it coming, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because the truth is, I didn't shock him by resigning. I shocked him by meaning it. My boss laughed when I handed in my resignation. Not a polite chuckle, not an awkward corporate smile, an actual laugh loud enough that a few heads popped up over cubicle walls. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, shaking his head like I'd just told him a joke. "You'll be back," he said. "They always come back." And in that moment, with 17 years of early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays, and emergency calls sitting quietly between us, I realized he truly believed I had nowhere else to go, that I was replaceable. That the company was the sun and I was just another planet trapped in its gravity. I'd spent most of my career believing loyalty mattered. I'd stayed through 3 restructures, 2 mergers, and 1 CEO meltdown that nearly took the company under. I'd rebuilt systems after layoffs hollowed out entire departments. I'd trained the people who later became my managers. I wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, didn't play politics, but I was dependable. The kind of employee executives love to forget about because things simply worked when I was around. Until the day they didn't. The laughter stung more than I expected. Not because I needed his approval, but because it confirmed something I'd been slowly coming to terms with. My value to him was invisible precisely because I'd been so consistent. I wasn't leaving in a blaze of anger or because I'd been fired. I was leaving because I'd finally seen the ceiling and because I'd quietly prepared for what came next. What my boss didn't know was that over the past year, I'd been documenting everything. Not out of spite, but out of habit. I tracked processes no one else understood anymore. I maintained vendor relationships held together by personal trust rather than contracts. I was the only one who knew why certain workarounds existed, why some temporary fixes had become permanent, and which systems would fail if pushed too hard. I wasn't hoarding knowledge I'd offered to train others countless times. Leadership always said it wasn't a priority, until suddenly it was. My resignation wasn't dramatic, 2 weeks' notice. Calm tone, professional language, that's probably why he laughed. He expected threats or emotion. He didn't expect confidence. He certainly didn't expect follow-through. My last day came and went quietly. I turned in my badge, cleared my desk, and walked out without ceremony. No farewell email, no cake in the break room, just a handshake from HR and a nod from security. It felt anticlimactic, almost disappointing. For a moment, I wondered if my boss was right, if nothing would change at all. Then the calls started. First, it was a panicked message from a project manager asking if I could quickly explain a system dependency before an afternoon deadline. Then a director asking if I was available for a short contract call. By the end of the week, my former boss emailed me directly, no laughter this time. The tone had changed. Polite, urgent. "We're running into some unforeseen issues," he wrote. "Could you come in for a few hours to help stabilize things?" I didn't reply right away. What they were experiencing wasn't sabotage. Nothing broke because I touched it. Things broke because no one else knew how they fit together. Deadlines slipped. Vendors pushed back. A compliance issue triggered an audit because a manual process I'd always handled quietly was suddenly missed. Small cracks turned into expensive problems. When I finally responded, I was courteous. I explained that I was now consulting independently. I attached my rate triple my old hourly pay with a minimum engagement requirement. There was a long pause, then a short reply. "Understood, please send over the contract." When I walked back into the building weeks later, no one laughed. My former boss wouldn't meet my eyes. Meetings were suddenly scheduled around my availability. My opinions were no longer brushed aside. I wasn't asking for validation anymore, but it was impossible not to notice the shift. The real shock wasn't that they needed me. It was how quickly they learned what my absence actually cost. I didn't stay long, just long enough to hand off knowledge properly on my terms for what it was truly worth. Then I moved on to better work, better leadership, and a career that finally reflected my experience. Sometimes I think back to that laugh, to the certainty in his voice when he said I'd be back. In a way, he was right, but not as an employee, not as someone to dismiss. I came back as the proof that respect is cheapest before someone walks out the door, and incredibly expensive afterward.